Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a special episode of Palladia Talks. Today we're going to talk about something that came up here recently by the new director of Final Fantasy XV, relatively new director, and that is Final Fantasy disease. Now, to him, what that means is that someone's view or image or what they hold as Final Fantasy trumps all other views of Final Fantasy, and that's what makes it a Final Fantasy to them, that it's negatively impacting the series itself. He also went on to say that it has affected the development team into thinking that they are too big to fail. Now, we've heard this before from the director of Final Fantasy XIV when he took over for Realm Reborn. And it's an interesting idea. He went on later to talk about some other things, but I'll get to that here in a little bit if I remember. But the idea isn't necessarily wrong. A lot of people I know have this thought in their head that if it's not like their favorite Final Fantasy, it's not a Final Fantasy or it's not a good Final Fantasy, and so on and so forth. Now, before I go any further, a little bit of background. I've been playing video games since 1987 and RPG since 1989. Now, I actually started out RPGs with Dragon Warrior 1 and then went on to Final Fantasy 1. And then Dragon Warrior 4, and then Final Fantasy 4/2, so on and so forth. And I've played a lot of RPGs in the interim. And the thing is, I like action RPGs, I like regular turn-based RPGs, I like mixtures of the two. But I'm not, all of this isn't to say that, oh, I have a better idea of this than you. I'm a master at this sort of thing. No. What I'm saying is that I know the kind of RPGs I like, and I know what works for me personally, and I know what flows. RPG is not the only thing I play, by the way, if you're wondering. Like right now, I'm playing Overwatch. Not as I speak, but you get the idea. Anyway, but the thing with Final Fantasy in particular is that you're talking about 25 years plus of history. You're talking about a system that has built from the ground up to this point, and you have 10 plus games that all flowed in a very similar manner and all felt very similar in their execution. Now, they were each different. That's one of the great things about Final Fantasy has always been things are different from game to game. And going into the new games, there's just enough familiar that you feel like you're slipping back into something that you know and that you love. But there's enough new stuff that it keeps you engaged. You're not always just doing the same thing over and over again, and things don't work exactly the same way, and so on and so forth. I mean, they've each got their differences. They've each got things they do right. They've got things they do wrong. And everyone takes something different away from every Final Fantasy. But the thing with that is that after that period of time, you have certain expectations. As a fan, you have expectations and you have things. You have staples. I call them staples. You have staples that hold together these games that make them that particular series. And that's why they're called that series. That's why the Dragon's Quest series is the Dragon's Quest series. That's why the Persona series is the Persona series. And those are the things that tie them together and make them that series. Now, what I said before, with each Final Fantasy being different, is true. You don't get continuations of story unless they do sequels like 10-2 or 13-2 and 13-3. And I always forget 12-2, or 12-2, because it's such an odd one out. But, like I said before, you have to have the staples that make that game that game. And one of the reasons that 13 wasn't particularly well received is because it had so few of the staples. Now, one thing I'll say about 15 before I go any further is that I'm giving 15 a buy. As hard as that was on 13 in the entire 13 series, I'm giving 15 a buy because it was not originally a main numbered Final Fantasy, and that is such an important thing. We tend to give the MMOs a buy. Like Final Fantasy 11, no one considers that a main numbered Final Fantasy. Same thing on Final Fantasy 14. Even though 14 has recently made a lot of strides towards being a more normal Final Fantasy, it's still not your typical main numbered series. And 15's not either. 15 was versus 13. But, I mean, they've never said this for PR reasons, but they just did 15 as 15 because they can't go for a long period of time without having another main numbered Final Fantasy. They can't. With the sales from 13.3, if you guys didn't see, that did abysmal, and 13.2, which did pretty bad as well. But, I say that, but we're still talking for 13.2, we're still talking millions. And I say abysmal, but some games would kill to have those numbers for sales. But that's not good sales for Square Enix. Like, they were disappointed with Tomb Raider's sales. But anyway, like I was saying before, we expect certain things from the series, and 13, stepping into 13, you started to kind of feel that at first, but then the further you went, the more constricted you felt. And that's always a big thing with Final Fantasy is freedom. And a lot of people say the illusion of freedom. And you know what? You're not wrong. Stepping out of Midgar, you have exactly 3 places you can go. and you have to go to at least 2 of those places. Actually, I think I've actually outrun the Midgard alone before, now that I'm thinking about it. Anyway, but that illusion is there. You step outside and you look around and you see all these different places that you can go. I mean, it doesn't mean you get to go to the river, obviously, but you can do it. And it's a nice illusion. It's the same with a lot of the development of... I'll use 7. I'll continue to use 7 examples, but they all have their examples for this material. You mold your character. You make them into what you want them to be. And that's not always a Final Fantasy thing, though. Actually, that's a big thing. I was talking about the differences. That's a big thing. That was a big difference in 7. But 6 also did this. If you guys never played 6 had the Esper system, where you learn things and abilities and got stats from Espers. So they're actually remarkably similar, but 7 lets you switch yours around more. So it's up. Anyway, but back to that. But those aren't even staples. Those aren't even staples I'm talking about. Magic's a staple. But, you know, that's not a big thing. That's a standard fantasy RPG staple. Summons are a staple, but those, because of Final Fantasy, I think, became more of a massive staple. But then again, you know, things like 13 had that in some manner. I'm rambling. I apologize. It's just this. I understand what he's trying to say. I really do. But I also believe that when you've got that long a line of established series, you have certain things that you have to do in order to keep calling it Final Fantasy. And a main number. Not side numbers. Not side numbers. Yes, I forgive side numbers. But for a main numbered Final Fantasy, you need that feel. You have to have that feel or people are going to start to flip their shit. Just to put it as simply as possible. Although right now Square has earned themselves a bit of leeway with the announcement of the Final Fantasy VII remake. Now, something else he mentioned is that he feels like Final Fantasy has to modernize or that it could fall behind. That's bullshit. And I'm going to call him out on this shit right now because the old Final Fantasies never stopped selling badly. You go back and you look at the sales for the old Final Fantasies, they all sold at least at the 5 million mark, and that is amazing. Actually, I think 12 might have only sold 3 million or 4 million. 12 might have been the only one to lag below that mark, and even 13 sold around the 5 million mark. And those are not bad sales, and those, not counting 13, were all the old system. It never failed them. It doesn't need to modernize in that department, but they wouldn't know because they've not used it since the early 2000s, mid-2000s. And they should have learned this with like Bravely Default and how Bravely Default did with their big competitor right now, with freaking Persona 5 being such a big thing in the market at the moment because people want that old style. No, these things don't have to modernize in that manner. Go and look at what Persona 5 has done to modernize it. They did it perfectly. That's how you move things forward. That's how you streamline things. That's how you make things sleeker and more responsive without taking away the soul. And for some reason, they've forgotten that. I've played both Episode Dusuke and the Platinum demo, by the way. Playing Dusuke was an interesting feeling. It wasn't terrible. It was like an odd, janky mixture of 13 and Kingdom Hearts. And that's the best way I can think of to describe it. Because you have more control than 13, but less control than Kingdom Hearts. So it's weird. But then you have Platinum, and Platinum just feels... I don't know. It's really hard to explain how I feel about Platinum's combat. And like, I'm not talking about like the obvious technical aspects of the demo that were showing off. Look how bright and shiny. I'm not talking about Kid Knock just because obviously this is a kid. But I'm talking about how they took what came from Episode Dusuke and they dumbed that down. And we were already at a low point with Dusuke's combat. And I say that from the perspective of someone who has mastered Devil May Cry. Yeah, I know these systems where it takes a lot to get into the technical aspects and to make them fun and engaging, and Dusuke didn't have that. Okay, Dusuke had that more than Platinum, but less than the actual more complex action RPGs. And I know I just said Devil May Cry. I don't consider that an action RPG. I consider that just plain action, obviously. But in comparison to, say, the Tales of series. The Tales of series has fairly complex combat for what it is, and then you've got the Star Ocean series. And even stepping back to Radiata stories. So, this is more simple than that. It's a more cinematic approach, which is, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. You know what I mean? I realize I'm acting like I'm talking to you guys directly, and this actually is posited to you guys. I don't know how I feel about this combat system because it's so far from what I have come to know of the Final Fantasy series. But the thing is, and this is important, is that you can change singular aspects like that and still have a Final Fantasy that feels like a Final Fantasy. Like, I'm not locked into the whole turn-based thing. I love turn-based. It's my personal preference. And the ATB system that Final Fantasy did for ages is one of my favorites. Like 10.2 catches a lot of crap, but 10.2 had about the best ATB system of an RPG that I played. I mean, it was very cinematic the way the combat moved, and everything had its own. How much time it took to either use or to recover from, and it was all spot on. It's just very girl power. And then we've got this. And the thing with 15, with Dusuke, I don't know because Platinum didn't give us a taste of it. With Dusuke, you had those moments when the battlefield was flooded with enemies and you were stuck right in the middle of it, and it was freaking awesome. I'm not going to lie to you. It was absolutely amazing that you'd be fighting like 10 enemies at once, and then the Empire would drop in some more soldiers, and it would get even more hectic. Those are moments that I love in action RPGs, and I can see this working very well. It's not going to completely bypass the issues that I have with the system if they can manage to retain that feel, which I did not get to see in Platinum because you don't have the party and you only fight one boss level monster. But if they can retain that, then they will have done a pretty decent job in making the combat feel not Final Fantasy, but modernized and cinematic. And how you take 15 is going to depend heavily on what you think of the combat, because you're going to spend so much time fighting, I think. But the story, you know what, I'm as negative as I am about a lot of the changes, I think the story is going to be an interesting romp, and I'm looking forward to it. And story is always a big aspect in these days. But other than that, I understand what he means by the Final Fantasy disease. I do. I know how some people are just locked into what they think. Like, I have people who want to see 7 done again in like every new iteration of the series, or 8, or 9, or 6. And that would defeat the purpose of Final Fantasy. I really think it would. But I do think that they need to remember that the old ways did not fail them. They never sold badly doing Final Fantasy the old way. They didn't. It wasn't until they started switching up these systems that sales started to flag. Or not even sales. You know what? Like I said before, 13 sold fine. 13.2 and 13.3 sold worse. But if you ever played them, I think you know why. Even though I'm going to go on record right now and say I love 13.2. I love that more because of the Pokemon aspect. I'm not going to lie to you guys. The story in that is awful, though, and 13.3 takes everything from those two and makes it worse. Which is sad, because if you've ever played 13.3, it has some flashes where it's a really interesting game. And then it just goes back to the crap it was tossing at you before. So anyway, yeah, no, that's about all I got to say. Is that if you are listening to this and you do have Final Fantasy disease, just try to put it to the side, okay? Try to look at them each as their own unique game. And if you don't like that game, don't play it. Actually, I encourage that. If you do not like what you see, or you've tried it and you don't like it, don't play it, and that'll help to guide them in what direction they need to be going in. That being said, I don't think 15 can do badly. For one, it has the entire Final Fantasy name behind it, and that is a huge name. And for 2, they just announced the 7 remake. I mean, come on. People are back on Square's side for at least this ride, and we'll see where it goes with it. Alright, and I think that's about all I got for you. Thank you guys very much for listening to me ramble. Also, yes, FTL in the background. I hope you guys ignored that. That was just there as a filler because it's much easier for me to use Fraps to record this stuff. Anyway, as I said, thank you guys very much for joining me, and I will be seeing you.